traditional medicinals.
Yeah, but we had the Whole Foods one before. I like the Whole Foods one.
That one's stronger.
Yeah. I think we're live.
Excellent.
We're
just
hello.
rattling on about tea.
Yeah, as we do. But yeah, this is good. Why don't you do a quick intro? I'm going to do a sound check while you let people know what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, welcome to our live stream. We're really happy to be here, and hopefully some of you get a chance to join us live and hop on that interactive chat so you can ask us some questions and we can do a little bit of a Q&A. It's always fun when there are people on at the same time as we, so that we can do that back and forth. But if not, no worries. If you're watching this as a replay, well, welcome. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully we answer some of your questions. And if not, then leave them in the comments down below. So we're talking about the art of interrupting, which I think is every person that I've told this to...
What is it do you mean by art of interrupting?
Exactly.
Is that how you do it?
Yeah, basically. Just talking about it with different people, they've said in the past week,
right.
They've said, wow, that's so interesting. Like, I definitely need that. So I think it's something that we definitely need as conversationalists, and to make sure that we're not being talked over, but we also want to be respectful, right? And let the person finish their turn. So.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like as a kid, we're always told that one shouldn't interrupt.
Yes.
Right? That interruption is bad, and that let people finish speaking before you enter the conversation. And to some degree, that's correct, right? I mean, you want to let people finish what they're saying, and interrupting can be jarring for the person you're speaking with, and can be rude, and in many cases it is. That said, there is a time and place for interruption, and even, I think, as you were getting at, in polite conversation, interruption in some ways can almost add momentum to the conversation, right? I feel like interruption done the right way sort of, it shows that you're engaged, and it kind of feels it adds on. It's additive as opposed to disruptive.
Right, and exactly, and it could be sort of showing that you're collaborating with them and you're in unison. And so I think there's definitely a right way, and there is certainly a wrong way. So when we talk about interrupting, the key is to find an appropriate time to do so, right? Because we're wondering now, well, okay, I want to interrupt because I want to get, a chance to speak and to add my thoughts and to contribute to this conversation. Because if it's just one person hogging the conversation, it's more of a monologue, and it's not, collaborative. So
and actually, before we jump into how to do it, maybe we can just spend a little more time talking about the scenarios in which you might want to interrupt.
Yes.
So.
What are you thinking of?
Well, I just interrupted you. And the reason the reason I interrupted is because she was about to launch into an important part of this conversation. But before that, I thought it'd be helpful for us to discuss this other thing. This is getting very meta.
Getting really meta.
But the point is, that's an example. That's an example where an interruption was not to disrupt the conversation. It was instead to ensure that it's to help guide the conversation. Right. It was a guiding interruption.
Right, and you maybe wanted some elaboration or clarification. Exactly. Right, so those are also important ways of finding the right moment to interrupt. So that was an opportune moment, right, for you to do that, and that was great. Well done.
Thank you.
This is all live, right? This is not rehearsed.
This is not rehearsed.
I
can assure you.
So when is it appropriate to interrupt? Well, exactly. When you want to make sure that something that you want covered early on is said at that time. Because imagine then Gregory said, 10 minutes into the conversation, when is a good time to interrupt? It might not have the same force as it would in the beginning, at which time you interrupted. Okay, so that's the first thing, finding the right time to interrupt. So you have to, in order to do that, you have to make sure that you're listening to the conversation, right? Instead of just like listening to what you want to say in your head, because active listening is a very important component of communication.
Right. So timed interrupt is one, or rather, interrupting to keep the conversation on track is one.
Exactly.
I would say another one is, and we've been in these situations when they're conversation hogs, right? So when someone is basically dominating the conversation, not allowing other people, person or people, to speak, you may need to step in to give other people airtime.
Exactly.
Right.
So that doesn't work just for yourself when you want to say something, but also if you see somebody else in the room who is trying to speak or they look like they want to participate, and then you help bring them into the discussion.
Right.
And teachers are really good at that.
Yeah.
I remember when I was teaching, every single year, I mean, I taught for like 10 plus years, and every single time there would always be somebody who you could tell you wanted to say something.
Yeah.
But then you'd have maybe some other overzealous students, and then they would sort of like dominate, and then so you'd have to find a way to bring people in. So same with good conversationalists when you're doing that. The other thing I want to say is, because we said it is sort of kind of, it's culturally relevant to when you might interrupt. In New York, there's this phrase that we have. It's called no gap overlap, which means you don't want any gaps in the conversation, meaning pauses, long pauses, and you want to be able to overlap, which in conversation analysis is what we're talking about, the interruptions, right? When there's overlapping text or words or utterances, rather, that means that there's somebody interrupted because the turn construction unit was not finished. The turn was not finished.
So what you're saying is, with no gap overlap, the hope is, or the goal is to make sure there's no pauses in conversation?
There's no pauses, and interruptions are invited.
And what scenario would you want to no gap overlap?
So I would think, well, okay, it's in, conversation among friends. It could be at a dinner. It could be also at, so those are more casual settings. But it could also be at a meeting where, when appropriate, you do interrupt, just like you did, right? But it could be...
Right. But I guess my question is, are we consciously trying to achieve a no gap overlap situation, or is it just happening organically?
So anthropologists looked at New York specifically, and they found this sort of trend, and it was subconscious. But if you think about it, people from New York talk fast. I mean...
Yeah. That's actually really funny.
Guilty.
I'm just thinking about my our family dinners.
Yeah. There's constantly
at my house. It's like
yeah.
There's a whole phrase called root-erupting.
Yeah.
There's a lot of no gap overlap situations.
Right. But that is the trend. That is the phenomenon that we find in New York area. So this is a way, I think, of also like engaging with people.
Right.
What are you going to say?
No, I agree with that. So that would be sort of a cultural phenomenon driving interruptions, in which case, because it's cultural, it's essentially considered acceptable.
Exactly. But we've had people from the West Coast join, and they are perturbed by the interruptions.
Shocked by it.
Shocked and quite, disapproving of them. So again, and this is also somebody from the U.S., but they're from, the Midwest.
Right.
And so that is not accepted, or it's not a trend, and it's quite, perturbing.
Right. It's just not sort of part of their cultural norms, and so
exactly
for them it's
shocking.
A bit jarring.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's also perceived as rude, right? So we have to think about now a balance, right? So definitely be mindful, I think, if you feel like you want to interrupt, but you're a little bit shy or reserved because maybe in your culture or where you're from, interrupting is not really something that one does in polite conversation. But if you notice that the people with whom you're engaging are, interrupting politely, then you can also do that. Like, you can take cues from the people around you in how they're behaving. But on the flip side, if you notice that, if somebody is not interrupting, they're very cautious, they're sort of, going at pace, then I would say be mindful of that and don't overdo it with the interruptions.
Yeah. You want to read it for sure.
Yeah.
There was one other situation where I think one might interrupt, which is if you, and this one's tricky, so I'm curious about your thoughts on it, where you feel like the information that's being said is wrong, right?
Yeah.
So in a public setting, this is particularly tricky because you don't really you certainly can't interrupt a speech. You could probably challenge them in a Q&A session later. But maybe in a meeting, certainly one-on-one, if someone starts going down a sort of line of, like their argument is predicated on something that you just flat out disagree with, or they're starting to communicate in a way that's confusing to people, I wonder, is that a place where you can interrupt? You want to stop the transmission of sort of inaccurate information. So what do you do there?
Definitely. I think if you find that there's something being said that was not appropriate or it was not factual or it was just completely out of line, then I think, yes, you do interrupt.
Right.
And you do it politely so that you don't put the person on the spot and make them feel badly.
Right.
But I think in order to shift it back to get it back on track, right, the conversation or the meeting or whatever, that would be an appropriate time to really leverage the transition relevance place, which is the TRP.
Right.
And it's a possible point of completion of the utterance. And the reason we say possible is because we're not sure.
This is TRP. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Transition relevance places.
Right.
So in conversation analysis, when the conversation analysts are evaluating and analyzing conversation, they're looking at how people engage in conversation, and they call it in situ. So they're not trying to put in situ, in the situation. Yeah, it's a Latin term. Anyway, not to go off on a tangent, but what they're looking at is how people engage with each other in conversation.
I think this is very interesting.
Without projecting their own assumptions or views on the speaker. And what you do, you really just have a text, right? If it's already transcribed. And so what you can see is in the transition relevance places, so if somebody interrupts, you can see that they might do it at a possible completion point when the intonation goes down, right? Because falling intonation signals
like the completion of an idea, maybe.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Right? If you keep your tone flat or leveled, that means you're going to continue.
Yeah, and actually, I remember this in the video you put out, which was it talked about that falling tone. Maybe we can give. I think you hear it a lot, and just to it's sometimes hard to write about.
Yeah.
But to say, right? It's there. My tone just fell. To say, right? And when you're starting to talk about something, that the tone is going up, right? So that suggests I'm about to say something else.
Right.
And I finish the else with a down tone.
Exactly.
So it's funny, like this is definitely your area of expertise, but it's fun for me to sort of think about how the words that you say kind of go in these waves. The tonality of your speech goes in these waves of ups and downs.
Yeah, it's the inflection patterns.
The inflection patterns, right? And so as you start to pay attention to those, that can definitely help sort of identify this TRP.
Exactly. So it could be intonation based. It could also be lexical, right? So it could just be one word, like yes, right. So that would be a possible point of completion at which a transition relevance place could occur. And we also have pragmatic completions, which are, pragmatically in the course of conversing with people, does it make sense? Like, does it make sense to interrupt at that point? For example, oh, she's a really good volleyball player. And then Greg jumps in, she is. And then I can jump in again after she is, because pragmatically that makes sense that it would be a possible completion point.
When I say she is.
Exactly.
Yeah, I did that earlier when you said, I don't want to go off on a tangent. I said, no, this is interesting.
Yes.
That's an interruption.
Yes.
That would be a pragmatic interruption.
Yes, exactly.
It's essentially just saying,
keep going.
Yeah. It's kind of it's like cheering on the conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. And then, phrasal ones. We have like phrasal ones. And then we also have the whole sentence where the whole sentence is complete. And like the dog that's a dachshund. Okay.
That's a dachshund.
That's a dachshund. Right? Okay.
And that's the end of it.
And that's the end of it.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that people who want to extend their turn, there's a couple of things that you can do so that you can prevent being interrupted.
Interesting.
We can get to that now, or maybe we can...
Sure, let's hear it.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on interrupting? Like, what are these nuances interesting to you?
I think it's fascinating because interruption, like I was saying sort of when we opened up,
yes,
it's a very powerful tool. And I think when it's used effectively, it can add a lot of energy to the conversation and leave people with a good impression of that conversation.
Definitely.
Right? I think when you engage with someone who's a good interrupter, and I mean a good interrupter, when you sort of finish the conversation, you think back on it, like in your mind you're thinking, wow, that guy's a great conversationalist, or girl, right? That person is a great conversationalist. And I think it's because it's used in a way to keep the energy up, to keep it on track, right? So the reason why I find what you're saying very interesting is because by becoming more attuned to it, I think you can be a better interrupter.
Right.
And by being a better interrupter, you're a better conversationalist.
Precisely.
And you make better impressions as a result.
Yeah. And you also can understand how if you really want to continue speaking and you want to make sure... Now, this gets tricky when the group size expands, right? When it's one person or two people in the conversation, then it's, you can manage interrupting and not being talked over more easily.
Right.
But imagine being at a dinner party with 10 people, 8 people.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to keep talking, right? It is. And so you have to be aware.
Very difficult to keep talking. What do you mean? Like if you're holding the floor, it's very hard to continue holding the floor.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And you know me, I don't like the gender distinctions about this, but research shows that women get interrupted way more than men do, like in the corporate setting.
I've just noticed that, the research aside, but it's interesting to hear that there's data that backs it up.
There's a lot of data that backs it up. And so the women out there, we have to make sure that we can hold our
some
turn.
Extra work.
There's some extra work to be done.
And for guys, extra work to be aware of that.
Yes.
I
like that. That's
right,
true.
To be aware of sort of maybe some, is it subliminal biases?
Yeah. Subconscious
biases. Subconscious
maybe.
behaviors. That's what it is, subconscious behaviors.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. But we can talk about how to hold your turn.
Yeah. So let's say, there's two versions of it. One is where you're actively doing it because you feel like you're being interrupted more than you should. But another is to identify when someone else is doing it and you decide that they maybe deserve to be interrupted at this point.
Exactly. Okay. So one way to hold your turn is to don't fall. Don't make your intonation fall at the end of your utterance, because if you do the falling intonation at the end or in the middle really of what you're saying, then people might think that you're ready to let them come into the conversation. So,
and that's when I jump in.
Exactly. So I think the best way to do this, because subconsciously it's very difficult to, do it on cue, like lower your intonation, keep it leveled, or rise intonation. So I would video record yourself and just having a conversation and see how you do it.
Yeah.
And then look at it and see, okay, I could interrupt here more, or I could hold my turn more here, or whatever.
Yeah.
So one way is to do that. The other thing is to not pause, because if you pause, you invite somebody else to come in.
Right.
Even if you...
I saw you actually just used a turn extender, which was so.
Yes.
Right? So you finished a phrase, and I was about to add something, but you popped in a so.
Yes.
And the so basically is like a wall that popped up, and I was like, and then I hit the wall.
Right.
Yeah.
Or but, or however, right?
Yeah.
So if you have these...
Or now.
discourse markers, and then you can pause right after that because you're keeping people on the edge of their seat. They're like, oh, wait, what's going to happen now?
Yeah.
Right? So really good observation. Very astute, Gregory. Well done. So you can hold your
There's
turn
hope
like
for me
that. Of course. Well, you're a very good conversationalist. So I did it again.
So, yeah, that's it.
And then speeding up, right?
Right.
These are all part of conversation analysis terminology. You can speed up to make sure that no one's going to take your turn.
Right. And now some of these you have to be, and there I just did something. So I said right, that would have been just an ending pragmatic.
But then you sped
up. But I
up.
put a now.
Yeah, and then you sped up.
Right, and I sped up.
Yeah.
To basically like, you know what it's like?
What?
If you drive, it's like merging onto a highway.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
And so if the highway's going at full speed, so that's the person who's talking and maybe hogging the scene, you're pulling in on the off-ramp onto the highway. You need to sort of rev up your speed and get up to the speed of the conversationalist and merge into traffic and hold your own, right? So that's at least the way it feels. So when I jumped in there, I try to jump in and match your pace in order to sort of keep speed with the conversation.
Exactly.
It's very, and this all happens sort of subconsciously.
Just up here, yeah.
Yeah.
It's all the inner workings of our brain. And you know, these happen, this is phenomenon that happens in every culture. And we do this just, when you're learning a different language, you have to be more thoughtful about it.
Yes.
Right? And deliberate. But even in your own native language, people don't necessarily know how to interrupt and when it's appropriate and to what extent and to how much, you know, to what degree as well.
Yeah.
They can do that.
Yeah, and one thing that I meant to point out is that the tactics we're talking about to prevent interruption or to detect someone who's preventing interruption, these tactics, if you are using them, should be used with care.
Definitely.
Because they are effective and they do prevent other people from coming in. And so, and moreover, if you are talking too much, then you start to lose the focus of the audience. So it's not just that you're preventing other people from talking, you might actually start to lose focus on what you're saying from the audience, from even just the other person, because you're not giving them a chance to participate. And if you're speeding up your language, then you're also less coherent, right? It's just harder for people to sort of parse the words that you're saying.
Yes.
And the sort of end result is that it lowers the comprehension of the listener, and therefore reduces your clarity of speech. So my point is simply, if you're using it, you should be using it very tactically. And in small doses when it's needed. Right.
And also think about, you know, the audience, because if it's a group of people who are not necessarily on the same page as you, be it with, you know, language, right? You might have different linguistic backgrounds, or on the subject matter, really be mindful of, okay, am I speaking slowly enough? Am I articulating? Am I, you know, taking care not to overlap? It's funny, like when I'm with friends from where I grew up, we all kind of speak in the same, like, excited, you know, what can you say exactly? Not high pitch, but like
fervor,
exuberance,
almost.
or
exuberance.
Exuberance.
That's good. Yeah.
And we speak kind of, you know, fast. But then, you know, with different people, it's different. So it really does depend on your audience.
Yeah.
And I also learned the other day that our sensory preferences are also really telling of our communication style. So there's 3 types. There's auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. And these are also learning styles as well, but they're not the same with their communication. So for example, somebody could be an auditory, have some an auditory sensory preference, but not be an auditory learner, right? They're not congruent. So that's something to keep in mind.
So what's the difference between those? Not to go down rabbit hole.
So kinesthetics, people with kinesthetic sensory preferences. Use language that's very like movement oriented. You know, all shaken up, and the growth this quarter was,
Right.
you know,
We've been tossing around ideas.
Exactly.
Like that's kinesthetic vocabulary.
Right.
Movement based.
And
visual, it feels like.
Well, mostly kinesthetic though, right? It's really, okay, there's some blending always.
I think I got us down a rabbit hole.
Oh boy. Anyway, the point here, what I wanted to say is that kinesthetics speak slowly because they're feeling the movement in their mind, and that movement to mind translation takes time. And then, what was it? I think it was, yes, auditory people speak fast. So
interesting.
Yeah, because I think it's like sound to. Anyway, I can make a video about this if you're interested, so that we can stay on topic.
Just let us know.
Just case in point there is so that if you're mindful of people's sort of like the way they talk and the pacing, if somebody speaks slowly, don't interrupt them because they're still thinking about what they're going to say. And I think it would not be appropriate to interrupt them because unless they've completely hogged the conversation, that's another story. But it takes time for them to put their thoughts into words, and you don't want to cut them off. And then if you interrupt them, you might run the risk of them not saying anything for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In general, I would say best practice when it comes to interruption is, and you were getting at this earlier, first assess the scene and on a spectrum of should I interrupt versus should not interrupt, start off on the side of not interrupt.
Yes.
Get a sense of how the conversation is going, the pace of the conversation.
Yeah.
I would go so far as to say do not interrupt for at least the first 10, 15 minutes of conversation, if not longer, just because you want to understand how they're what type of communicator they are, or if it's a group setting, what type of communication the group is sort of behaving with before you start to interrupt, because people notice interruptions, and if you're applying it in a way that's disruptive, that's going to leave a very sort of unsavory taste in this, your listeners' mouths. So
right. So it's fascinating. There's really so much to unpack with the conversation dynamics, and that's what you were getting at, I think, with really assessing the dynamics, because it's so important to be mindful of like what's going on. Like, can we figure this out?
Right.
Yeah.
So
I think
lots to chew on here.
Definitely.
But hopefully this helped sort of expand on what we were discussing in the video.
Yeah.
And obviously there's a lot of, I think, departure points even from this conversation. So if any of those interest you, just let us know in the comments so that we can elaborate as you see fit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Cool. Yeah. Well, hopefully that felt lively.
It did.
That felt engaged. I think we are interrupting on a relatively
appropriate basis.
Feel free to critique us.
I know,
if you think one of us is interrupting more than the other, or if we're always open to feedback.
Of course.
So cool.
Right.
Thanks for joining, guys.
Thank you for joining us. Happy Explearning.
Yeah.
And we'll see you next time.